Today, let's make some simple hem tuck socks for ladies on the mid-gauge machine. These only require one bed. Later, I'll do a tubular version. This is a classic shape, and it does have a seam. Traditionally, people wear the seam to the inside of the foot, which means we need to knit the socks as mirror images. It's possible to make the seam more invisible than mine is, but I have elected flatness over invisibility. If sock knitting interests you, my other sock books may also interest you. I have several. They all have different attributes, and I will put a link to the page on my website where they're sold so that you can read about each and see if any of them suit your needs. But on with these. For ease, start with a few rows of waste yarn. Hang whatever amount of weight your machine requires in that waste yarn and knit in a row of ravel cord. Use number 4 yarn on the light end of the spectrum. This is Mary Lou's Liberty. For socks, I like a firm fabric. On my Artisan 70D, stitch size 8 is getting that. It's more like 4 or 5 on my Brother KX 350, and for you LK 150 knitters, that's going to be your range too. The fabric gauge is quite important for socks because a 1/4 inch of circumference is a whole shoe size. This pattern is for 5.33 stitches, 7 rows per inch. We are going to start by E-wrapping 40 needles, which will make a lady's size 5 sock. The written pattern, which will appear sometime in 2021 in Country Knitting and Maine News and Views, has lots of ladies' sizes. I E-wrap in hold position and then set the carriage so that it will knit back from hold. It's just a way to make this first step easier. The hem is 14 rows long. That will be a 1-inch hem when closed. Knit them at 1 whole stitch size, possibly 2, smaller than the main knitting if you want that sock top to be snug. We're knitting the hem right now. That will be a 1-inch hem. When all of the rows are complete, lift the initial E-wraps. They're easy to see because they're set aside by the contrasting color of ravel cord, and lift them onto the needles. Here's a close look at the process. You can see how easy it is to locate those stitches. Continue that process all the way across the work until every E-wrap is hung. Now be sure to set the carriage for main stitch size. Bring the needles forward to allow them to knit back from hold because that first row will be stiff. And knit whatever number of rows you want for the sock top. Let's knit 28 rows. In this case, that will give us 4 inches of top plus the inch of hem we've already knitted. So above the heel shaping, there will be a 5-inch sock top. Here you can see the original waste yarn, the ravel cord that we'll pull out later, the completed hem, and the sock top. Now we knit the heel. The first method that I'm going to show you is a short rowed heel. Later in the movie, I will show you an alternative because I know some people just hate short rowing. But the secret to short rowing that's successful is really just enough weight in the right places. I'm using the heavy forks, and I show you how to make those in my Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools book. On the side away from the carriage, put half of the needles in hold. For the first sock, we'll begin with the carriage on the right and needles on the left go into hold. For the second sock, begin with the carriage on the left and needles on the right go into hold. For the size we're knitting, that's 20 needles going into hold, and be sure to set the levers on your carriage so they will stay in hold. Knit 1 row on the remaining 20 needles, wrap the nearest held needle, and place a needle on the side away from the carriage in hold. Knit across and wrap it. The wrapping is done with the working yarn, and make sure after the wrap is complete, you remove any slack from the working yarn. Now I'm going to change up slightly and show you the automatic wrap method, which I think is my favorite method. And to do it, we now begin just knitting across and then putting the last needle that knitted into hold. As each row involves fewer and fewer stitches, we are creating the shape of the heel. I will show you a different method of short rowing for the toe. Normally you would use the same for both, but I want to give you as many options as I can in this pattern. The reason for using some kind of wrap, automatic or manual, is that otherwise a hole will form in the fabric where one needle knits and the next one over does not. Move the weights around frequently so that the pouch of knitting that's forming is continually pulled down to the optimal degree. When stitches rise up and try to jump off the needles, that's a sign that your weights need moving. And as you get familiar, you can actually feel it happening before it actually does happen. That's the ideal time to adjust the position of the weights. Short row in until there are only 6 needles in work after you push the last one into hold. Using the automatic wrap on the side away from the carriage, we return one to hold before knitting the next row. Be alert and keep moving the weights as often as you need to keep them optimally pulling down the stitches that are knitting. Now, having done the automatic wrap, we don't necessarily have to wrap on the way out, but I am using the option of doing so. It does create a very sturdy heel. So each time a row is knitted, to use the wrap, wrap the needle with the working yarn right next to the final needle that just finished knitting. Then on the side away from the carriage, push one needle next to those knitting but that was in hold back to upper working position, knit across, then wrap the needle next to the one that just newly knitted. Continue in this manner until all 20 heel stitches have knitted again one time. The best way to determine your favorite method of short rowing, whether to wrap both directions and whether to use the automatic wrap or the manual wrap, is to do a long strip of knitting, try them all out, and compare the results in a yarn that you like and use often. Choose the one that looks best to you and you find easiest to do. On the sock at hand, once all 20 heel-involved stitches have been knitted at least once, it's time to return the held needles to work, either by manually pushing them back to upper working position or using the levers on the carriage, and we'll resume knitting on all those needles. For the size 5 ladies sock that we're knitting, in the gauge of 7 rows per inch, we will knit 44 rows. If your row gauge isn't quite perfect, you can tweak the row count to make the length of the socks perfect. The heel and toe must be knitted on the same 20 needles as each other. So for this sock, I'm using the right 20. For the other sock, it will be the left 20 in both cases. Ordinarily, we would short row the toe exactly as the heel was short rowed. I am going to use the manual wrap rather than the automatic wrap, just so as to be able to show you how to do it, and you pick the one you like for both events. It starts out the same way. Knit on 20 needles, wrap the nearest held needle. On the side away from the carriage, place a needle in hold, knit across, wrap that held needle. But this time, instead of changing so as to put a needle in the hold after knitting the row, we put the held needle, the newly held needle, in the hold on the side away from the carriage before knitting each row. And the entire short rowing process proceeds like that. In the hold on the opposite side, knit across, wrap the most recently held needle, and repeat going back. Just as with the other method, exact placement of your weights is very important to keep the stitches knitting off smoothly. I usually hang one claw weight at the point where held stitches and needles that will be working touch when I start the toe or heel. Then I use 2 heavy forks and keep moving them so as to make sure that no slack is forming in the pouch that is being created for the heel or toe. As with the other method, we'll short row down to 6 for the shortest row, but because our held needle is put into hold before knitting the row, there actually will have been 6 truly knitted that row. Then we'll return the stitch nearest the held ones, but on the opposite side of the carriage to work. While short rowing out, that's the name of the process by which the rows contain more and more stitches, you have the option of manually wrapping the nearest held needle or not. Doing so will not be quite as smooth because there are going to be 2 wraps in each position. On the other hand, it's very strong. So again, it is a judgment call that you will determine based on the characteristics of your yarn and what the socks will be used for. Now, this toe is all knitted. We need to remove it on waste yarn and Kitchener stitch it closed. So starting on the left, I added a strand of ravel cord and I knitted it left to right, and now on all the needles right to left. The left 20 are the ones that will be the top of the foot, and here is what we have. The pink is my waste yarn, but in this case I used my waste yarn to knit some other ways of shaping, which I will show you in a moment. You can see here that the toe and heel are shaped exactly the same as you would expect because we knitted them in the same manner. And take a close look. You can see differences in the way the automatic and the manual wrap look. So that's why we usually try to be consistent, but they're both presentable. This is a decreased heel and toe, which will be seamed together, and they are the same shape as the others. So there is no shame in it. If you just can't get comfortable with short rowing, you can follow the decreased toe and heel method that I'll show you towards the end of the video and get a perfectly presentable sock. To finish this blue one, we need to Kitchener the toe closed and then sew the side seams together. First step is to remove the waste yarn that began the sock, and I will pull out the ravel cord to do that. My ravel cord isn't true ravel cord. It's a scrap of old cotton yarn that's not very strong and is breaking, but it still creates a neat separation. And there we are, nice top hem. The classic toe closure is Kitchener stitch, and I'm going to try to make it really clear so if you've been upset by it before and felt you couldn't manage it, you can. The sharply contrasting ravel cord is quite a help. It begins by going up with the needle and the yarn tail through the stitch on the side nearest you, which is the side where I short rowed the toe in this picture, and up on the opposite side. Then thereafter, we move back and forth across from the toe side to the foot fabric side, going down into a stitch that was previously worked up through and up through the next stitch over. Then go back to the other side, down through a previously used stitch, up through a new stitch. I had the worst trouble with this, so if you're having a time, I think if you didn't learn it at your mother's knee, and I did not, it's not that easy to learn as an adult. But I tell you who fixed me on this one, and it's Laura Canan, who said, remember you work into each stitch twice. And that made the whole thing gel for me. Perhaps that will help you too. After a few stitches, you'll be able to turn the waste yarn to the inside of the sock and see the edges of the toe, the part that we short rowed, aligning with the part of the foot where stitches were held. And of course, my ravel cord is trying to get into the act, but we'll move it and move on. Down, up, and then across towards me, down, up. With the ravel cord as the point where you fold and the waste yarn on the inside, the visibility of what you're trying to accomplish suddenly gets much, much nicer. So all the way across the sock toe we go. Be patient. It is only 40 total stitches, so you only have to work back and forth 20 times. You can do this. We end up with neat continuous columns of stitches. Toe completed, it's time to work the side seam. What's desirable here is to work the flattest possible seam you know how to make. I have been having good success whip stitching the knots together, or in some gauges, whip stitching every row together. Here's what the difference is. In machine knitting, it's a feature that the edges of the work alternate between tight little stitches along the edge on one row, and we call those the knots because of their appearance, and longer stitches called the bars. Joining those knots will make a tighter join than joining the bars. But use any seam that is flat and comfortable and you like it. Now let's take a quick look at the alternate shaping method, the decreased heel and toe. As with the short road method, we only use half of the stitches to work the heel and toe. The decreases occur every other row, and you will want to use some sort of weights just as for the short road method, but you don't have to be as fussy about moving them. Knit 2 rows, decrease 1 on each side of the stitches that are in work. Half of the stitches are being held. We don't do anything with them. Then knit another 2 rows, work a decrease on each side. I'm demonstrating with simple decreases, which do a perfectly presentable job. If you prefer full-fashion decreases, those will also work nicely. Just as when using the short road shaping method, we will decrease down to 6 stitches. After knitting the row that contains only 6 stitches, we knit across once and then begin increasing. If you prefer full-fashioned increases, you may use those. Just make sure that you're not using the same stitch over and over, or you'll get a terrible distortion. I'm showing you simple increases because I have found a nifty way to seam that makes the toe look just as nice as full-fashioned increases do. We'll seam these edges together eventually and have a toe. Now I've just knitted a few plain rows to simulate the length of the foot. This is an abbreviated length. And half of the stitches again go into hold because we will knit the toe on the same half that were used for the heel to begin with. The first half of the decreased toe is exactly like the decreased heel. We knit 2 rows, decrease 1 on each side, using whichever decrease you prefer, and repeat that until 6 stitches have knitted. And when the short row of 6 stitches has been knitted, we change up and we bind off. Here I'm doing the transfer bind off with fingertips. At this point, the portion of the toe that goes on the bottom of the foot is complete, and we repeat the identical operation on the remaining 20 stitches, and that is the toe that goes to the top of the foot. Now we'll need to seam it together. The toe is very easy because where there are decreases, the edge is neat and tight, so just seam it using any smooth flat seam that you like. The first half of the heel that we knitted also involved decreases, so that's neat and tight. But the increases, if you use simple increases, created long bars at the edge of the work. So here's the trick. Along the decreased edge, you can work in anywhere you want. Along the increased edge, you don't want to try to sew those sloppy bars together. Reach past them into the next stitch over so that you get a nice tight stitch to anchor to and stitch into that. While it's not traditional, this makes a perfectly presentable and, even more important than that, comfortable seam to wear on your foot. Having this around the end of the toe doesn't seem to bother anybody. Everywhere you see one of the long strands from an increase, reach the needle past it, work into a true stitch that's going to be just adjacent, and it will hide the long float as well as make a neat seam. Once seamed, the decreased and increased heel and toe have the same shape as the short road one. If you're anxious to knit these and size 5 is not the size you need, a very similar pattern appears in my book made for mid-gauge called Snappy Socks, sized for all adults. It's a slightly different gauge than this one, has a lot of sizes, and several style variations, so you can make it anybody's favorite pair of socks. There's a link to the sale page for Made for Mid-Gauge in the program notes.